right, good morning. It's good to be here this morning. My name is Reed. I'm one of the pastors here. What a great day it is to be here worshiping our great God together. Before I begin, I'm going to dismiss the kids so they can stand up and head out this front door with their teachers. And yes, I am wearing a long-sleeve shirt. And I see you out there, those who put on sweaters and long sleeves, and we're ready for fall. I know that we're probably not there yet, but we can pretend, right? Yesterday and today, I lit a fall candle, pumpkin clove, in my office, and I just sat there, and I opened the window, and I was like, it's fall. Just think it's fall. So we enjoy that. I grew up in Denver, and then I lived many years up in northern Wisconsin, the frozen north. And so I love snow. I love cold. I know that doesn't make me popular here, but I pray for those miracles when we might have snow someday here in Lodi. Well, as we continue in our study, if you're just joining us this morning, we have been, as a church, going through the book of Acts. And what a journey it's been as we've seen the birth and the growth of the church. It's our history as a church. And as we look at these passages, we are tracing this theme of the gospel to the ends of the earth. And as we look at Paul today, we've been tracing his journey, and we heard from Stephen last week, but now we are going to be continuing in chapter 17. So if you want to turn there, we'll get there in just a moment, but you can go ahead and turn there. If you need a Bible, you can grab one right underneath the seat in front of you. If you need a Bible, if you don't have one at home, please take that. That's our gift for you. You know, as we see all the kids go out and we hear the chatter, I love that noise, don't you? I even love hearing it in our service. And we say that often. If you have kids and they're in the service and they're making noise, as kids do, don't feel embarrassed by that. We love as a church to welcome kids into our service. We love to have them in here when we sing and are worshiping together. So we love to hear the sound of children. But sometimes, and if you're like me, we have a 2-year-old, you listen to kids talk and you're like, what are they saying? Sylvie now is nonstop chatterbox. And usually my trained ear can pick out what she's saying, but sometimes, and if you've been around her, you just have to sit there and laugh because she's just babbling. She knows what she's trying to say, but it's not connecting. It's not making any sense. And you think, are you speaking a different language? You know, is our daughter some prodigy and she's learning multiple languages? And I know that's not the case. But sometimes we feel that way when we are trying to talk with others, especially as Christians, as a church. Our whole focus through the book of Acts has been that we are to go share the gospel. But sometimes it feels like we're trying to communicate something that people aren't understanding. Do you ever feel that way? You're trying to explain this truth that has completely changed your life, that you're excited about, and you just see a blank stare. It's not connecting. They're not getting it. Now, we've talked about the importance of the Spirit of God working in people's lives to give them eyes to see truth. But sometimes we think, man, I should have explained that a different way. I should have said something different, and we put this pressure on ourselves. How do we communicate the gospel in a way that people understand and that they can know, and that light clicks on in their head and they say, that makes sense to me? There's a story, and I know I've said this often, I love missionary biographies. I love reading the stories of people who have gone out and given their lives to share the truth of the gospel to deep, dark places around the world. And one of the books that I love it's a book called The Peace Child. Has anyone read that? Peace Child. All right, write it down, mark it on your list. It's written by a man named Don Richardson. And Don Richardson and his family, and when they moved out there, was his wife and young child. And they were missionaries to the Sawi tribe in Papua, Indonesia. So you have the island of where Papua New Guinea is, and then it's split in half, and there's an Indonesian side. It wasn't that at the time, but that's the region that he was in, and they were missionaries to this jungle tribe there in Indonesia. And so as he's there, he's building relationships, he's meeting the people, and they're embracing him. He's helping them, teaching them how to build different things, and they're really welcoming them and accepting them. And he gets to the point where they're sitting around and he's sharing the gospel with them. And he gets to, and it's building up, and he's thinking, here, I'm finally sharing truth. And he gets to the point where Jesus is in the garden with his disciples, and here comes Judas with the soldiers, and he betrays Jesus with a kiss. And this is an emotional time for us if we think of this. Jesus, the Son of God, who is God himself, has come and lived a perfect life, and here he is being betrayed by those who he trusted, his own disciples, Judas. And as these Sawi tribe members are listening to this, they begin to kind of laugh, and they say, tell us more about this Judas. Because, see, in their culture, they highly prize someone who could be so tricky and treacherous, and they viewed Jesus as a fool who was duped into believing and trusting in Judas. And so they looked at Judas and thought, man, tell us more about him. This is someone who we would want our daughters to marry and who we would respect. And you can imagine Don's frustration as he began answering these questions, and he's like, no, you're missing the point. And he thought, how could I ever explain the truth and the beauty of the gospel of Jesus bringing peace when they don't even understand this basic concept? What they prize is if you can make someone believe that you're their friend, but then turn around and betray them. And so he prayed to God that there would be some way that he could help them understand the truth of the gospel. And as he was with the tribe more often, and as these warring tribes around them were fighting and there was conflict, he began to see something. I believe God revealed it to him. And he found out that in these tribes, the only way to really make peace between tribes, peace that was real and lasting, was for a father of one tribe to give his son to the other tribe as an offering, as a sacrifice, to go live with that tribe. And then they would send someone to the other tribe. And this sacrifice was a bond of peace, saying, we are going to be reconciled. And it was lasting. And so if you read the book, or there's a movie made about it as well, if you listen to the story, this is the path that he was able to sit down and explain to these people the gospel. And they understood, and many of them believed, and that village was changed. You see, Don Richardson had the truth. He knew the gospel, but he had to find a way to communicate it to these people so that they understood and could know what Jesus had done for them. How do we communicate the truth of the gospel? If that truly is what we're called to do, how do we do it in our context? So I want us to look at Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 34. And as we read this together, we're going to look at Paul and his example as he went to Athens, and to pull truths from that we can learn and understand of how we are to communicate the gospel in our culture. So let's read that. You can listen along as I read out loud. Acts chapter 17, beginning in verse 16. It says, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed when he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with those who worshiped God, as well as in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also debated with him. Some said, what is this ignorant show-off trying to say? Others replied, he seems to be a preacher of foreign deities, because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. They took him and brought him to the Areopagus and said, may we learn about this new teaching you are presenting? Because what you say sounds strange to us, and we want to know what these things mean. Now all the Athenians and the foreigners residing there spent their time on nothing else but telling or hearing something new. Paul stood in the middle of the Areopagus and said, people of Athens, I see that you are extremely religious in every respect. For as I was passing through and observing the objects of your worship, I even found an altar on which was inscribed, to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he is Lord of heaven and earth. He does not live in shrines made by hands. Neither is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives everyone life and breath and all things. From one man he has made every nationality to live over the whole earth and has determined their appointed times and the boundaries of where they live. He did this so that they might seek God, and perhaps they might reach out and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Since then we are God's offspring. We shouldn't think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image fashioned by human art and imagination. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God now commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has set a day when he is going to judge the world in righteousness by the man he has appointed. He has provided proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some began to ridicule him, but others said, we'd like to hear from you again about this. So Paul left their presence. However, some people joined him and believed, including Dionysius, the Areopagite, a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So here we have this passage, another one of Paul's adventures. This is a pivotal passage in the book of Acts, one that you might have heard before or heard of. This is where Paul speaks at Mars Hill, there in Athens. But what can we learn from it today? Why is this important to us? As we look through Paul's encounter with these learned men and women of Athens, how can we understand how we are to share the gospel? How do we communicate truth? This morning I want us to look at, first of all, our mission, and then our method, and then our message, all right? I got 3 M's, all right? I worked hard on that, okay? 3 M's, mission, method, and message. First of all, our mission. This is what we've been establishing as our foundation this whole study through the book of Acts. Our mission as a church, as Christians, is clear. It's to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. You know, as we think about this, and as Jesus said to his disciples, commanded them to go to the ends of the earth, we realize that, yes, that is our call, but sometimes it's hard for us even to go across the street, isn't it? We know our calling, and we have these grand ideas of, yes, the missionaries that go out and share the gospel to these people who have never heard. Yes, let's support them, and we'll do that, and we're called to share the gospel, but we can't even cross the street or go next door or talk to those who we work with or interact with. We are called to share the gospel. This is our mission as a church. Every single Christian, we are called to this. But in doing that, as we look at Paul here in this passage, we must recognize the need that surrounds us. So here we have this picture as Paul was evacuated from the previous city, as we learned about last week. He goes to Athens, and it says that he's waiting there for his companions. And as he's waiting there, he's walking around the city of Athens. Now, Athens was a very influential center in the world. You think about what the Bible was written in, right? What Luke and Paul are writing in as they write down these things. It's in Greek. This city had a huge impact in its language and thought and religion all throughout that region. But in this time when Paul was there, which is very interesting, it had kind of seen better days in the past. It had declined in influence, but was still influential. There was only about, they estimate at this time, around 10,000 people that lived in Athens. Now, if you'd go there today and look out across the sprawling city, that's hard to believe. Excuse me. But as he was walking around, Athens is described as a forest of idols. Some theologians and historians say that there were probably a lot more idols there than people. And so Paul couldn't help but notice everywhere that he turned, statues, idols, temples, all claiming to worship gods of all sorts. And what does it say? As he saw these things, he was, the word there is deeply distressed in this translation. But the term shows not just deeply distressed, but a strong irritation or a righteous anger. He sees these things and he's angered by it. Not where he's going around knocking things down, right? But it hurts him to see so many people crying out and worshiping things that have no life, made out of stone, covered in gold, and people are devoting their whole lives to it. It hurts Paul. He sees the need and it weighs heavily on him. What emotions does it bring to us when we see the glory and worship that belongs to our God go to other things? You know, I think this is a challenge for me. Because we go out as Christians and we see the world that we live in, and we see so many people living with no thought of God, worshiping so many other things. Yet we just say, well, that's how the world is. And if anything, we're pulled toward it, accepting it, wanting to be like them, not wanting to be weird because we're different, instead of seeing those things and feeling what Paul felt. We see the need, and it weighs on us. You see, the human heart desperately seeks for something to worship. That's how we're made. God made us with that inside of us. It's in our very nature to worship something. God's design was for us to worship Him. Yet we turn that into worshiping every other thing that we can possibly worship, even something that we fashion out of stone or wood or metal. This is what Paul sees, and it reminds him how important his mission is. It reminds him that he needs to do something about it. So I would encourage us and challenge us that we not only need to be aware of what we're called to do, but as we go out into our world, we should recognize the need. And it should weigh on us to the point of pushing us to do something about it, to share the gospel. So this is our mission. Next, we move to our method. Don't worry, all of these points are not going to be that short, in case you're wondering. Our method. The gospel witness that we're commanded to, our mission, requires us to go. It requires us to go. So when Paul sees this, he's distressed by it. He's frustrated that these things are being worshipped instead of the one true God. And he doesn't just go like, oh, that makes me so angry, and go back to wherever he was staying. He does something about it. It drives him to action. He goes. We know this is our call. Matthew 28:19. As Jesus left his disciples, he said, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." That word, go. Paul went to where the people gathered. He didn't wait for them to come to him. He didn't set up a little table. He didn't sit in a building and say, hey, if you want to hear, come. He went. He went to the synagogues, as we know he often did, to engage those who claimed to be God-fearers but didn't know Jesus. And then he went to the marketplace. He went to where discussion was happening. He went to where those who liked to talk about these things would be, so that he could engage them with the gospel. He didn't sit in his home. He didn't sit in his church. He went. My prayer is that we never become a church that we do our thing here on Sundays. Yeah, we preach the gospel from the pulpit. And if you want to know the gospel, then come through these doors, right? No. We come here to be equipped so that we can go out and share God's truth. We are called to go. Go across the street. Go to your neighbor. Go to your coworker. Go on a missions trip. Share truth. Be active. Not only do we need to go to these places, go to where the discussion is happening, but we must know who we are trying to reach. We have to know who we're trying to reach. We have to be aware of what they believe, the things that they trust in. We must know what drives their worldview so that we can build a bridge to the gospel. We have to know who we're talking to. And Paul does this. You see, the people of Athens were highly educated and philosophical. They loved sitting there and just talking about these things. They wanted to know the latest philosophies and teachings. They thought they were pretty smart. These were the highly educated people of our day. Paul went there, and he knew them. He didn't immerse himself in their life and their teachings, but he knew enough to be able to build these bridges and to talk to them in a way that they would understand. Luke portrays Paul as being more than able to reason and dialogue with these men. So here in this passage we see, as we read, that there's two groups that are represented here. The Epicureans and the Stoics. Just quickly, the Epicureans, they had a materialistic view of the world, even the gods. They thought these are real people or they're physical gods, not just spirits. And the chief end of life for the Epicureans was pleasure. True happiness is found in the pursuit of pleasure. The Stoics, on the other hand, they prized logic over emotion. We use that term still today. Stoic is someone who's very serious, right? Doesn't get pulled away by their emotions. They believed that self-sufficiency was the highest good in life. So the Epicureans lived by the phrase, enjoy life, and the Stoics lived by the phrase, endure life. So you have these two thoughts as Paul approached them and sought to share the truth of the gospel. Very different than any of the people that he's encountered up to this point. So we can see how he thinks and how he engages these people. It's funny, as he begins to share, they completely reject his ideas and call him, in our text it says a babbler, right? Nobody wants to be called a babbler. Right? That's even hard to say sometimes. A babbler. But the word used here is basically a word scavenger. It gives a picture of a bird picking up little seeds here and there and spreading them around, almost like a gossip, trying to pick up bits of knowledge and put them together and claim that they're his own. Not a flattering term. This is what they say Paul was. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So they bring him before this council at the Areopagus. And if you've ever seen pictures of Athens or anything, and we'll see one here in a moment, but Athens, there's called an Acropolis. So in many of these Greek cities, there would be a high point, which they would build kind of a fortress where they could run to if they needed to have security. But many times, that's where all the temples were. And in college, I took a class on Greek and Roman history, and we got to take a trip to Athens. And it was incredible to see this. We got to stand on this the hill of Ares, Mars Hill, where Paul is gathered to talk to these men. And as he's brought before them, this is not like a good thing. You might read this and think, oh, they're just curious. They want to know more. They're open to hearing about the gospel. But the reality is, this was a group of men that was tasked with the responsibility of testing any new idea that came into the city to see if they were going to allow it. And in fact, Paul knew as he stood there years ago, there was, as I believe it was Socrates, had the very same encounter. He was brought before this same group, and he was told, okay, tell us what you believe. And he was accused of bringing false deities, the same thing that we read about here, that Paul was accused of. And his end was he was ultimately killed for it. So you can imagine this is in Paul's mind. This is not a great thing. It's not like, oh, they want to hear more about what I have to say. No, this was a heavy situation. And he's brought before these men, you can imagine it, sitting there, and he starts to proclaim the gospel. But we see as he does this, as we continue to talk about our method, we must expose the idols. We have to know who we're talking to, but we have to know what the idols in their lives are, and we have to expose them. In our culture, we're probably not going to see temples filled with golden statues, right? That's how things are. You go in different places around the world, you'll see that. But here in our culture, what we interact with, we don't see that very often. But there's no shortage of idol worship around us today. Timothy Keller wrote that an idol is anything more important to you than God. Anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. Anything you seek to give you what you want. Sorry, anything you seek to give you what only God can give. You get the point. I thought I copied and pasted that, but anyways, an idol is whatever you look at and say, if I have that, then I'll feel my life has meaning. Then I'll know I have value. Then I'll feel significant and secure. So if we just picture in our mind an idol as a statue, we're missing the point. If we look at our own lives, even as Christ followers, we realize we probably have idols in our own lives that we lift up, that we look to instead of God, anything that's more important to us than God is. We need to be able to recognize what idols grip those who we are trying to reach. And like Paul, expose how inadequate they are to meet our deepest needs. People are trusting in something. They're hoping in something. They're holding on to something for meaning in life. And if it's not God, then the reality is what they're hoping in is not going to satisfy. It's going to end up disappointing them. And so as Christians, we want to look for those things and not just go in there and be like, well, that's dumb. I can't believe you pray to this statue. It's just a piece of rock. We don't see Paul do that. We don't see him belittle them. But we do see him expose the inadequacies of their idols and their worship in order for them to see the reality of the one true God. And we do that so that we expose these idols so that we can point them to Jesus. See, people create idols because they are desperately searching for meaning and for satisfaction, for some distraction from the difficulties around them, the pressures of this life. We can often be really good at finding ways to connect with people, to build that initial bridge that opens up a way that we can share the gospel, but then we just stop there. Right? We build relationships, and then 5 years later we're saying, oh, we're just waiting for the right moment to share the gospel, right? We're good at making connections. We're not always good at drawing people, bringing them to the point of conflict. And by that, I mean showing them how their worldview, their idols are going to fall short. And in that, pointing them to Jesus, the only one who can satisfy. Showing them the reality of their need for Jesus. But this must be our end, or we offer no hope. So we see our method. We see what Paul did. We see how it relates to us and encourages us to go, to be out where people are, to start to begin to build these bridges, to identify idols and expose them so that we can point people to Jesus. But what is our message? When we get that time, when we finally are able to sit down and share the truth, what is our message that we give them? And you might think, well, it's simple. It's the gospel. And yes, that's true. The gospel doesn't change. It is our consistent message that we share with people. The gospel makes sense to the human heart here in Lodi as much as it does in some small village in Africa, because it's built into the human heart. It's how God created us. But how do we share that message? First, we see a contextualized gospel. What do I mean by that? A contextualized gospel. This is tailoring our presentation of the gospel to a certain place, a certain time, and a certain people. This is presenting the gospel in a way that our surrounding culture can clearly understand. If you join us on Wednesday nights, we're going through talking about how we interpret the Bible. And one of the key points is the Bible was written in Greek. And if I got up here and started reading Greek, I'd probably mess it up a lot, and you wouldn't understand a word I'm saying, right? So the goal is, even in translation, is God's word is living and active. But we have to put it in a language that people can read and understand. When we're seeking to share the gospel, we want to know our culture. We want to know those people that we are talking to so that we can give them the clear, full gospel in a way that they understand. That's contextualizing the gospel. The gospel doesn't change. We do not compromise truth. This does not mean that we kind of soften it and make it easier to handle and easier to hear. But if we look at Paul's example, how he does it, he's straightforward, points people to Jesus. But we see how he does that. Let's look at that. For he begins by building a connection. What is our starting point? Paul stands up before this group and he realizes my life could be on the line. How am I going to connect with these people so that they understand there is one true God and they must worship him? So he begins by pointing to this idea of the unknown God. What is our starting point with the gospel? Where do we begin? You know what, we do this with a lot of other things in life. You know, I recently took up the sport of pickleball, all right? I know what you're thinking. I must be really good, right? So Stephen and I have started playing pickleball, and we got ourselves a great coach so that we could prepare. We're going to play with some other pastors, and we said we don't want to be out there and not know what we're doing. So we got into this, and it's a really fun sport. If you haven't tried it, try it. It's great. Let us know. We'll play with you. But as we went out there, none of us had any idea of what this sport was or how we played or what the rules were. And so as people began to explain to us how it works, they would often ask, well, have you ever played tennis before? And I'd say, no, Stephen's played tennis. And they say, well, have you played ping pong before? I say, yeah, I've played ping pong. It's pretty good back in the day. And so they gain this, okay, this is what we're starting with. And then they build on that. So they say, just like tennis, these are the similarities. Here's the differences. Just like ping pong, well, you use a paddle and you hit it over the net. I don't know. There's other things. But they draw similarities so that you can begin to understand. If they started at the beginning and just said, all right, you're outside. There's a court. You draw some lines. Here's a net. It's this tall. Like, you're probably thinking, okay, let's get to the important parts. But if we can establish where someone else is at, we can much easier explain to them what we're trying to get them to know. We do that a lot in life. That's just one example, right? So with the gospel, that's where we begin. We go in and we want to know the people that we're talking to. What is their worldview? What do they believe in? What do they worship? Just like Don Richardson, as he went to that tribe, what are things that they value? And how do I use that to point them to Jesus? Paul acknowledges at the beginning there that they are very religious. He says, I recognize you are highly religious. And they're probably thinking, yes, we are. Yeah, you know, he's somewhat flattering them. And then he says, as I was walking around, I saw all the idols around, and I saw this one that was an idol to the unknown God. And then there's a picture. So this is on Mars Hill, the Areopagus, which could also refer to that council. But you can only imagine, as Paul is talking there, I've stood in this place. As Paul is talking there, you look behind him and you see the Acropolis and this giant statue of Athena, who Athens is named after. All of these temples. What a backdrop for him talking about this. He says that the unknown God. Paul acknowledged that they knew of this unknown God. They recognized that he existed, but they did not know him in the respects of having a relationship with him. He's saying, I know who this unknown God is, and in fact, he is the only God. Let me tell you about him. He draws the connection. Romans, written by Paul after this, 1:20 through 23, tells us about this very same thing that Paul saw here in Athens. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, which the Athenians claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. This is exactly what we see in Athens. This is what we see in our day today. The evidence for God is all around us. But people try to believe and put their trust in so many other things. They don't want to recognize God as their Lord, as the one true God. So once he builds this connection, he begins leading them to the truth of the gospel and exposing their idols along the way. So we see him in his message that we read. It's an amazing, if I could probably spend a lot of time just on breaking down how he went through the gospel. But we see he went from creator all the way to final judgment. He began with this fact, okay, the unknown God. Let me tell you about him. He is the creator of all things. He is the one true God. And this flies in the face of what they believe, because here they are creating their gods, right? They're fashioning them with their hands. And the Greeks, you know Greek mythology, all the gods that they worshipped were very human-like. They even struggled, had the same desires and conflict as humans had. But to say that there was one God who created all things, this was hard for them to believe, but it was the truth of the gospel. It says that he cannot be confined to a house, as behind him are all of these temples that they built to house the gods. He said the God who created all things doesn't need a house. That's why we don't stand up here and say, this building is the house of the Lord, right? He does not live in buildings made with hands. He lives in our hearts. This is the God we serve. What an incredibly freeing truth this is, to know that God created us. In a sense, Paul is freeing these men and women from being trapped by their philosophies that tried to push God out of the picture. How freeing this truth is that we are not just a clump of cells descended from monkeys, right? Moving through life with no purpose. Can you imagine believing that? We'd like to think, well, a lot of the world believes this. We have the truth of the gospel that shows them that God created them for a purpose. How freeing this truth is. So God is creator. Not only is he the creator, but he is the sustainer of all things. Verse 25. Verse 25 says, neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives everyone life and breath and all things. God is our sustainer. He gives us life. We are dependent on him for everything. You know, how often do we live, or do we see people live as though we are independent of God? Well, I don't need God. How is God relevant to my life? Well, let me tell you, every breath you take is him. Everything that you have is his. We owe everything to God. He's why we're here. It makes you think, well, how, if I deny him and reject him, how does he still give me breath? What an incredible mercy of God. Paul begins to lay this out. He is creator, sustainer, but also the ruler. See, God is not distant. He's not unconcerned with the affairs of his world, much like the Greek gods were. He is the ruler of all things. He is the one that created Adam and had a plan for the nations and their boundaries and the histories of all things. God is active in our lives and ruler over all things. So God is our creator and sustainer and ruler. Paul says, okay, we've established this is who the unknown God is, the only true God. What should this do? It should drive us to seek him. Hebrews 11:6 says, "Now without faith it is impossible to please God, since the one who draws near to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek after him." So Paul says here in verse 27, look how that verse describes searching after God, reaching out. The word used there is like, it gives a picture of groping in the darkness. But then he says, but God is not far from us. And that's the truth. God is not far from us. So why are we groping around in the darkness? Why can we not see him? And the one word answer to that is sin. Sin blinds us. Our own sin blinds us from seeing clearly. For apart from the light that comes from God and his truth, we cannot see. But God, through the gospel, the truth about Jesus, opens our eyes. This is the joy we have of sharing the gospel, because we know the truth that we're speaking, a truth not our own, the truth that God has given to us, can take the blinders off people. They can see the truth. They can see God because of the power of the gospel and his Spirit working in their hearts. We see there, he ends with this reality that we are created in God's image. In him we live and move and have our being. He's quoting, again, making another bridge of connection. He's quoting one of their poets. How foolish to think that we can create something that we would worship. The created creating the creator. It doesn't make sense. But that's, in a sense, what he was doing. So he uses reason to show them how foolish their idols are and point them to Jesus. So we've built this connection. We've identified and exposed the idols. We've explained who God is. What now? Paul calls them to repentance. He says, if all of this is true, God has commanded you to repent. God has not only revealed his glory in the world around us, but he has specifically revealed himself through the person of Jesus Christ. We are without excuse. No one can claim ignorance. I didn't know. Paul points to the fact that we will be held accountable for our choices. We have to get people to that point. That's not a comfortable thing to share with someone. Hey, you're not believing in Jesus, and if you continue down this path, there's going to be consequences. But that's the truth. And that is the most freeing thing we can tell someone, because it points them to the truth that the gospel brings. He says there that the day of judgment is set. There will be a day when we are held accountable for what we did with the truth of the gospel. And if we pursued other things instead of God, the Bible calls that rebellion, and we will be judged. But if we see what Jesus Christ did on the cross by dying for our sin, and we place our faith and trust in him, we are redeemed. And we have hope. You see, in these verses, it's interesting because Jesus is referenced twice in these verses here as one, first of all, the one who brings judgment, but also the one who brings salvation. He's resurrected. And because of his resurrection, we have hope. He offers salvation. So as we close here, what do we see? Paul gives this message. He's not killed, right? It says as soon as he mentioned the resurrection, that flew in the face of what all these people believed. They thought their whole goal, the Greeks' goal, was to get rid of their mortal bodies so they could be free of it. Why would they ever want to return to it? So they rejected this idea of resurrection. And so when they heard that, many of them ridiculed him. You know what? There's times when we share God's truth and we will be ridiculed. That will happen. But what else do we see? We see some who said, hey, we'd like to hear a little bit more about this. There's a curiosity. They didn't jump in and accept it, but they said, we'd like to hear more. And then we see that there was belief. There were some, only a few, it says, but there were some. You read in verse 34. It says, however, some people joined him and believed, including Dionysius the Areopagite. So that means one of these guys who was sitting on the council, who was the learned man of the day, highly respected. You can imagine how this might have made him look in front of the others, but he believed and he went with Paul. And then this lady, Damaris. They believed, and it says others with them. These names represent real lives that were completely transformed by the power of the gospel that Paul preached that day. And God can and will do the same thing when we faithfully proclaim his word. Some people look at this and say, well, that was a failure. Most of them didn't believe. We don't even have a record of a church being established in Athens at this point. So was this a waste for Paul? No. This was the beginnings of a group of believers there in Athens. People's lives were transformed because Paul faithfully preached the gospel. So, as we think about this, we look around in our world today. There are a lot of counterfeit gospels, false idols, worthless distractions today that blind people from knowing the one true God. So what are we supposed to do? When we go out from here, how do we engage those around us? First of all, the most important question is, are we worshiping idols? Look at your own life. One, do you know Jesus? Have you reached a point where you say, God, I'm not going to follow after these other things. I know that I am not perfect. I'm a sinner. And because of my sin, I am separated from you. But Jesus died on the cross for me. He paid the penalty for my sin. And if I place my faith and trust in what he did on the cross for me, that relationship with God can be restored. I believe that. If you haven't done that, today can be that day. What idols are you worshiping? Even as Christians, if you claim to be followers of Jesus, what idols are you following after? What in your life has become more important to you than God? Identify that, expose it, and get rid of it, because it will not satisfy you. It cannot provide that satisfaction that Jesus alone can bring. Secondly, are we broken by the need? When you look around, do you see the need of the gospel? Do you see people living with no thought of God? And how does that make you feel? Are you okay with it? Is it not that big of a deal? Or does your heart push you to want to share truth with others? That's the last question. What are we doing about it? Do we recognize the need around us like Paul did? And then what are you doing? Are we contextualizing the gospel? Does not mean changing it, does not mean softening it, but how do we approach people? Do we get to know them and say, hey, look, here's some points that we can share, just like that missionary did. He found something that they believed and something that they held highly, and he used that to introduce them to Jesus, who could transform their lives. Think of ways that you can do that, but you must know who you are trying to reach. You must seek to build those bridges so that they too can know the same hope that you have, the hope that only Jesus offers, the one true God. Let's proclaim him as a church. Let's pray.